financial heartland, and it has nothing to do with market crashes or mergers. This time, the spotlight falls on a moment that stunned everyone inside the glass-walled boardroom of Blackwell and Company, one of the city's most powerful corporations. Witnesses say billionaire CEO Adrian Blackwell, a man whose name is synonymous with precision, control, and intimidation, broke every rule of corporate decorum when he leaned forward during a high-stakes meeting and whispered something so unexpected that it froze the entire room. The words, quiet but deliberate, were directed not at an investor, not at an executive, but at a young woman pouring his coffee. Her name was Grace Bennett, and until that instant, no one in the room even knew she existed. Grace had been at Blackwell and Company for only 2 weeks. A temp worker from a staffing agency, she spent her days delivering files, answering phones, and keeping the caffeine supply steady for the executives who barely looked at her. Her uniform was a plain black apron, her shoes practical and worn from long shifts. She had never expected to be noticed, least of all by the man at the head of the empire. Adrian Blackwell was known for his composure, the kind of man whose expression never changed even when the stock market did. So when Grace stepped into the boardroom that morning, balancing a tray of steaming coffee cups, she expected nothing more than polite indifference. Instead, she found herself standing at the center of something no one could explain. The moment came quietly, without warning. She leaned forward to refill his cup, the rich aroma of roasted beans rising in the air, and that was when he said it. "Pretend you love me now." The words were soft, controlled, but heavy enough to stop her heartbeat. She froze mid-pour, her wrist trembling, the stream of coffee hovering dangerously close to the rim. For a split second, she thought she'd misheard him. Surely, this couldn't be real. But one look at his face told her otherwise. His jaw was tight, his tone unshaken, and his eyes, cold, sharp blue, held hers like a silent command. There was no smirk, no trace of amusement. Just something intense, deliberate, almost pleading beneath the calm exterior. Around them, the boardroom carried on. The CFO scribbled notes, the marketing director adjusted her tie, and someone coughed impatiently, irritated by the small disruption. The company lawyer offered a thin, patronizing smile, as if to say she didn't belong there. Grace stepped back, cheeks burning, her fingers gripping the handle of the carafe like a lifeline. She couldn't think, couldn't move. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to disappear the way invisible people do. But she didn't. She looked up once more, and Adrian's expression told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't a joke. He wanted her to stay still. To play along. To trust him, for reasons she couldn't begin to guess. The meeting resumed, but for Grace, time fractured. She stood by the wall, hands folded, trying to breathe evenly as the voices of power and profit filled the air. Every few minutes, she felt his gaze flick toward her. Never lingering too long, but always returning. It wasn't the gaze of a man flirting or teasing, it was one of calculation, as if she had just been cast into a role in a story only he understood. She tried to calm the storm in her chest, to focus on her duties, but her mind kept replaying those words. "Pretend you love me now." What could he possibly mean? Was there someone watching? Was he trying to send a message? Or was this some cruel display of power, testing how far the invisible girl would go to keep her job? The minutes dragged like hours. She counted them one by one, her nerves stretched thin as the men around the table discussed numbers with sterile precision. When the final presentation ended, polite applause filled the room. Laptops closed. Chairs scraped against polished floors. Grace exhaled, thinking it was finally over. But as people began to leave, Adrian's voice cut through the low chatter with effortless authority. "Grace," he said. The sound of her name, her actual name, made her freeze. No one else ever said it in that building. A few heads turned in curiosity. "A moment, please." The executives glanced at one another but didn't dare comment. Grace hesitated, then followed him as he walked toward his office. The glass door closed behind them with a soft click, shutting out the murmurs from the hall. The skyline glittered beyond the windows, cold and endless, like the man himself. She could still hear the echo of his whisper. "Pretend you love me now." The words hung in her mind like a riddle with no answer. To the rest of the world, Adrian Blackwell was a man made of steel and silence, untouchable, unflappable. But something about that moment told Grace there was more to the story. Something hidden behind the immaculate suit, the headlines, the empire. She didn't know it yet, but that one whispered sentence had already set in motion a chain of events that would change both of their lives, and the reputation of Blackwell and Company, forever. The next morning, the restaurant buzzed with hushed voices. What had happened the previous night had already spread beyond the kitchen walls. The story of the quiet waitress who had corrected Adrian Vale, the man everyone feared, was now the topic of every whispered conversation. Some admired her bravery, others thought she was doomed. People argued whether she would even make it to her next shift. The golden table had seen many employees come and go, most of them leaving silently after crossing the wrong line. But Lena's act wasn't ordinary. It had disrupted a pattern that had ruled the restaurant for years. The only question was how the billionaire would respond. Adrian Vale was not a man who tolerated defiance. His world ran on rules, precision, and control. To him, success was built on maintaining order, and order required fear. But that night, something about Lena's calm defiance had unsettled him. He hadn't lost his temper, but her words had replayed in his mind long after he left the restaurant. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. There was no challenge in her tone, no disrespect, only quiet certainty. She hadn't tried to humiliate him, and yet somehow, she had made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time, self-doubt that he had built his career by trusting only his own instincts. People either obeyed him or left. He had no time for explanations or second chances. But now, he found himself replaying that small moment, the stillness of her expression, the steadiness in her hands. He realized that while everyone else in his world had feared him, she had simply done her job correctly. And that truth unsettled him more than anger ever could. By midday, the restaurant staff had fallen into uneasy silence, waiting for news. Lena came in quietly, as always, though she could feel dozens of eyes on her. Every coworker she passed looked at her with a strange mixture of admiration and pity. She didn't know whether she should expect a termination notice or another chance. She told herself she had done nothing wrong, that she had spoken only the truth, but her heart still raced. Fear lingered even when you believed you had been right. Hours passed, and still no word came from the office upstairs. It wasn't until evening that the manager approached her, face unreadable, and told her that Mr. Vale wanted to see her. The walk to his office felt longer than it should have. Every step echoed like a warning. She knocked softly, and his voice, steady and deep, told her to enter. Inside, the billionaire sat behind his desk, the same composure on his face as always. The silence stretched between them. He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, unsure what was expected. He studied her for a long time before speaking. When he finally did, his words were slow, deliberate, almost cautious. He told her he had reviewed her service reports, checked the guidelines she had mentioned, and discovered she was indeed correct about the placement standard. There was no apology in his tone, but there was no anger either. He asked her why she had chosen to speak up when she could have simply apologized like everyone else. She hesitated, then replied that she respected the rules of her work and didn't want to misrepresent the standards she had been trained to follow. Her voice was soft, but it carried a quiet conviction that filled the room. Adrian said nothing for a while. Then, unexpectedly, he thanked her. It was a single word, spoken so simply that it stunned her. He didn't smile, but something in his expression softened for just a moment. He dismissed her after that, but the meeting left a strange weight in the air. When she returned to the main floor, the staff stared, waiting for her reaction, but she said nothing. All she said was that she had spoken with him and that it was fine. Nobody believed it could really be that simple, but over the next few days, the atmosphere began to shift. For the first time, Adrian Vale started noticing the people behind the uniforms. He began observing instead of commanding, asking instead of ordering. It wasn't a sudden transformation. He was still strict, still precise, still the perfectionist everyone knew. But he was quieter, more thoughtful. On several occasions, he asked Lena small questions, about procedures, about service details, about things he'd never bothered to ask anyone before. It became clear to everyone that her courage had left an impression on him. The change didn't go unnoticed. The staff, who had once walked in fear, began to feel a small, unfamiliar sense of ease. They still worked with discipline, but now there was less tension in their movements. Mistakes were corrected, not punished. Conversations returned to the kitchen, laughter crept back into the air. Lena, who had once blended into the background, had become a quiet symbol of strength. She didn't seek attention, didn't brag, didn't even speak of the incident again. But everyone knew it had been her courage that broke the silence that had ruled their lives for too long. One evening, as the restaurant prepared for another high-profile event, Adrian called a brief staff meeting. Everyone stood in careful rows, expecting another set of orders. But instead, he spoke about standards, teamwork, and respect. He said that excellence didn't come from fear, but from pride in one's work. His tone was measured, but sincere. It wasn't the kind of speech anyone had ever expected from him. When it ended, there was a long, stunned silence, followed by hesitant applause. The staff exchanged glances, unsure what to make of it. But beneath their confusion was relief. They had seen something change, not just in their boss, but in the place itself. For Lena, life at the Golden Table gradually settled into something resembling normalcy. She kept working hard, serving quietly, just as before. But now, people looked at her differently. The chefs respected her. The manager consulted her about small details. Even Adrian, on rare occasions, would offer a brief nod of acknowledgement as he passed. She never sought validation, but she couldn't deny the sense of quiet pride that came with knowing she had done the right thing when it mattered most. Over the following weeks, rumors began to circulate outside the restaurant. Word spread through the hospitality circles about the billionaire who had been corrected by a waitress and had accepted it with grace. Some exaggerated the story, turning it into gossip, but those who knew the truth understood its meaning. It wasn't about humiliation or rebellion. It was about integrity, about the simple power of someone choosing honesty over fear. Adrian's empire continued to grow, but those closest to him noticed that his leadership began to change. He started promoting employees who showed initiative, rewarding skill rather than submission. When asked in a later interview about his management philosophy, he surprised everyone by saying, "Sometimes the smallest voices carry the truest lessons." He didn't mention Lena by name, but the people at the Golden Table knew who he was talking about, and so, the shy waitress who had once been invisible became, without ever intending to, a quiet force of change. She hadn't raised her voice or defied her boss with anger. She had simply spoken the truth with dignity. In a world that often mistakes silence for weakness, she had proven that calmness could be stronger than authority. The restaurant continued to shine, its gold reflecting not just wealth but a new kind of respect. Behind the polished tables and soft music, a lesson lingered in every corner, that even in places ruled by fear, one act of courage could rewrite the rules entirely.